Joanna's daughter read the legal notice in silence, her hands trembling. "You're evicting us?" Harper whispered. Joanna looked up from her tea. "I'm reclaiming what I built." Her son-in-law Blake scoffed. "You wouldn't dare." Joanna slid the stamped court order across the table. "I'm your mother," she said, "not your fallback plan." "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." They said I looked tired, suggested I take a short walk. I stepped outside and saw their cars still in the driveway. Joanna Collins hadn't expected the kitchen to smell so much like rosemary and lemons. The roast had come out perfectly, its juices pooled in the pan just like Robert used to insist, and the cornbread was barely cool before Harper swept it into a basket, lined with a fresh linen napkin. Everything was curated for comfort. The weathered teak table on the patio, the soft clink of ice in glasses, Blake's bourbon laughter rising at just the right cue. But beneath it all, Joanna could feel something tightening in the air, something she couldn't name yet, but had long ago learned not to ignore. It was just past noon on a Sunday, and the brunch dishes had barely finished steaming in the sink when Harper stood and stretched with theatrical lightness. "Mom," she said, with a practiced smile that looked more host than daughter, "why don't you take a little walk? You've been such a help all morning. Let Blake and I finish up here, okay?" Joanna hesitated, drying her hands on the towel folded beside the sink. "I don't mind staying," she said. "We haven't even looked at the garden." Harper laughed too quickly. "You always say that. Go stretch your legs. It'll clear your head. Honestly, you look a little worn down." Blake chimed in from the living room without turning away from his phone. "It'll just be a few minutes, Joanna. We've got to go over some legal paperwork, executor stuff, boring probate details, nothing that needs your time right now." Joanna nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the papers spread across the dining table, edges straightened too neatly, pages she hadn't seen before brunch. "All right," she said softly, "just a short loop around the block." She stepped outside into the early spring air, still tinged with the earthy coolness of melting frost, and began walking down the brick-lined sidewalk that edged their cul-de-sac. The wind was mild, but sharp enough to make her draw her coat tighter. Her leather flats clicked softly against the pavement, and the distant hum of a lawnmower buzzed like background static. The neighborhood was quiet, tucked into its late-morning lull, all trimmed hedges and careful symmetry. Joanna had walked these blocks 100 times since Robert passed, but today her feet moved slower. When she reached the end of the block, she paused under the old birch tree, its white bark peeling like thin paper. Something about the way Harper had spoken. It wasn't quite off, but it wasn't natural either. It was curated, like the brunch, like the napkins, like the absence of Joanna's name on any of the legal pads. She turned around, walked back slower. As she neared the house again, she noticed something that stopped her cold. Parked just a few doors down, half shielded by Harper's overgrown hedges, was a car she knew well. A dark blue Audi, older but well kept, with a dent near the rear fender from a decades-old winter storm. She hadn't seen that car since Robert's funeral. It belonged to Davis Harper, her late husband's estate attorney. Joanna stood still for a moment, long enough to feel the chill of the wind sneak under her collar. Then, quietly, deliberately, she made her way toward the side of the house, where the kitchen window was always cracked, to let the scent of cooking escape. She moved along the flagstone path, careful to keep her footsteps light. Voices carried through the opening. "She hasn't asked, so we don't offer," Blake was saying. His tone was calm, but not casual. It was the voice of a man trying to stay neutral while saying something calculated. "If she presses, we show her the amended copy. If not, well, it's what Robert would have wanted." Harper's voice came next. Lower. "We have to be smart, Blake. She's not senile, but she's not at her sharpest either. This is about simplifying." Joanna stepped back before the air could leave her body in a sound. The breath she'd been holding stayed trapped in her chest as she slowly walked away from the window. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound, didn't cry. She just kept walking, each step deliberate, each movement measured like the hundreds of financial plans she'd once mapped out down to the decimal. By the time she reached the sidewalk again, the sky had shifted slightly, more blue than gray now, as if the day had made a quiet decision. Joanna pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in almost 6 months. It rang twice. "Linda?" Her voice didn't shake. "I need access to the vault." Joanna walks quietly back down the street and makes a call. "Hi, Linda. I need access to the vault. They said family comes first. I checked the documents." Apparently, it didn't. The hallway still smelled faintly of eucalyptus and toner. Joanna stepped into the familiar office with the slow certainty of someone opening a time capsule, one lined not with trinkets, but with truths. The framed diplomas on the wall hadn't moved. Neither had the jade plant on the filing cabinet, now overgrown and leaning like it was listening for gossip. The windows were half-frosted with age, and the hum of the overhead fluorescents buzzed with soft insistence. Linda stood at the far end of the room, hair pinned back in her usual no-nonsense twist, reading glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She looked up and smiled in a way that didn't pretend. "You didn't say what this was about," she said, closing the drawer of a low filing cabinet. "But I figured it wasn't just a social call." Joanna nodded, unsnapping the clasp of her handbag as she sat across from her. "I need to see the trust, the original, not the copies Blake paraded around after brunch." Linda's smile faded into something more professional, familiar. She stood and walked over to the wall safe, spinning the dial with a practiced flick. The mechanism clicked once, then again. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked without turning. Joanna stared at the window, at the faint outline of herself in the glass. "Number. But I'm not in the mood to be lied to a second time." Linda pulled the door open and withdrew a single navy blue binder. It was thick, worn at the edges, with a slim elastic band holding it closed. She handed it over without a word. Joanna took it with both hands. The weight was heavier than she remembered. She flipped to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's, neat, measured with tiny ticks on his lowercase t's like he'd been taught in Catholic school. Her own initials were next to every revision from their long nights at the dining table years ago, drafting the estate the way people map futures, with hope, caution, and too much trust in permanence. Page after page bore her name. As co-author, co-grantor, co-executor, everything was balanced, accountable. But then she hit the flagged divider labeled amendments. Her stomach tensed as she flipped past it. The next page bore a scanned signature block, blank. The amendment itself was typed, annotated, and ready for filing, but there were no signatures, no notarization. The language, however, was unmistakable. Redistribution of primary assets contingent on spousal competency. Executor reassignment in event of cognitive degradation. Healthcare guardianship assigned to Harper L. Simmons and Blake E. Simmons. Joanna's breath caught. He never signed this. Linda had already moved to the corner, pouring water into 2 mismatched mugs. She set one in front of Joanna and sat again. Number he drafted it after the stroke. Brought it in twice, both times said he was still thinking about it. Last time he left without taking it back. "I kept it here, just in case." Joanna ran her finger along the margin. "So they knew it existed, but not that it wasn't valid." "Exactly." Linda leaned forward. "And there's something else. Keep reading." Joanna turned the page slowly. Another tab marked contingencies. It was a clause she barely remembered writing, buried deep in the appendix of the original trust. Her hand flew to her chest as her eyes found it again. In the event of coercion, undue influence, or executor negligence, all fiduciary control reverts to Joanna E. Collins at her sole discretion, pending preliminary court approval. Joanna closed the binder gently, as though afraid it might disintegrate. "They missed it," she whispered. Linda exhaled softly. "They always do when they're too busy trying to cut corners." Joanna sat back, her shoulders slowly straightening like someone remembering their full height. For the first time in days, she didn't feel like a guest in her own legacy. She finds a clause that was conveniently missed, granting her full executor override in case of manipulation. They called it legal housekeeping. I called it erasure. The documents were heavier than memory allowed for. Joanna spread them across the dining table in the lakehouse, Robert's old retreat, now stripped of its laughter, but still faithful in utility. The grain of the oak beneath her fingertips was worn smooth from decades of Sunday mornings and quarterly reviews. Now it became her war desk. Outside, a heron skimmed low across the lake's rippling surface, its wings casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. Inside, the house smelled of dust and dried cedar, with the faintest trace of Robert's aftershave still clinging to the wool throw draped across the arm of his chair. She didn't sit in it. She had her own seat now. Joanna opened the oldest folder first, labeled in her own handwriting from 15 years ago, J+R Retirement Investments, updated 2010. She remembered color-coding every tab, back when Harper was still in college and Blake hadn't yet proposed. The ledger sheets rustled softly as she turned them over, tracing columns of dividends, retirement accounts, trust allocations. Her pen, uncapped and ready, hovered. They'd said she should rest, that going through papers would only stir up old stress. But the truth sat in ink. Her eye caught a line, joint account dividend split, converted to single 2019, authorized by B. Simmons. She circled it. Next, a red folder marked charitable disbursements. That one felt heavier, emotionally, not physically. It was the foundation she'd helped set up after Robert's diagnosis, their way of honoring decades of shared blessings. A scan of a bank transfer showed $25,000 marked Legacy Tech Initiative, Phoenix, Arizona. She froze. Blake's college roommate, Jeremy, had founded a startup in Phoenix. They'd shown Joanna his pitch deck at Christmas 2 years ago. Nothing about Alzheimer's research, just a data optimization platform for mid-size brokerage firms. She closed her eyes for a moment, grounding herself. When she reopened them, her hands moved faster, methodical, practiced. Pages flew. The air around her grew heavy with stale sunlight and buried transactions. Then she reached the tan accordion file labeled Property and Refi, Sycamore Home. She unlatched the clasp and pulled out the first sheet, and that's when the air changed. Her own name stared back at her from the bottom of the document, signature in a pale blue ink she would never use, scrawled with a careless slant she never had. Joanna had signed her name the same way since she was 14, crisp, left-aligned, never looping the J. But here, on a home equity line of credit request dated April of last year, her name bled like forgery, just convincing enough for a glance, but wrong in every angle. The form authorized a withdrawal of $180,000 against the Sycamore property, Robert's and Joanna's primary home until his death. Purpose: renovations/office expansion. Recipient account: BES, Consulting Group LLC, Blake Edward Simmons. Joanna leaned back slowly in the chair, the light from the window hitting her cheekbone in a soft half-shadow. She didn't move for a long time. Then she stood. She walked to the kitchen, retrieved her phone from beside the coffee pot, and opened the voice memo app. The silence between clicks was deafening. Her breathing was shallow, but her hands steady. "Note to file," she said quietly, her voice like velvet laced with steel. "Fraudulent use of joint property, forged authorization, home equity withdrawal traced to BES Consulting, April 2022, document copied, preparing further records." She ended the memo, exhaled once, and set the phone down. The wind outside had shifted. Somewhere across the lake, wind chimes began to stir, metal on metal, soft but ominous. She returned to the table, gathered the forged document, and slid it into a clear protective sleeve. Then she reached for the final binder, one she hadn't opened since Robert's stroke. Inside were meeting minutes from their joint investment reviews. The last one she had attended was 3 weeks before his speech began to slip. She remembered Harper's gentle nudge after that. "Mom, why don't you let Blake handle this stuff from now on? Dad can barely speak and it just stresses you out." Stresses you out. As if silence wasn't stress incarnate. Joanna reached into the back of the binder and pulled out a page that had come loose. It was a draft agenda for a 2021 planning session she never knew happened. Blake's initials were on the margins. The location? Harper's sunroom. She blinked hard. There'd been meetings, dozens maybe, and her name had only surfaced when they needed it to. She sat again, slower this time. Then she opened her laptop. In her inbox sat an old email from the notary her family had used for decades. Subject line: verification complete. J. Collins authorization, Sycamore Reefy. Joanna clicked it open. Her breath caught as she saw the note. Doc was pre-signed. Dropped off by BS, said Mrs. Collins was unavailable due to illness, but had already signed. Her jaw clenched. There had been no illness, and she had signed nothing. She clicked forward, typed Linda's email, attached the screenshot of the forged withdrawal request and added a single line. Attach this to the vault file. We're not just revising, we're litigating. Then she hit send. Joanna sees a home equity withdrawal request with her forged signature. They invited me to tea. I brought a recorder. The teacups were bone china. The kind Joanna had gifted Harper on her 35th birthday, etched with soft roses and trimmed in gold leaf. She could still remember the wrapping paper she'd used. Now they sat gleaming on linen napkins, arranged like offerings, fragile, perfect, easily shattered. Harper smiled too, widely as she poured Earl Grey from a silver kettle, the steam rising between them like a veil. "We haven't done this in so long," she said lightly, setting the teapot down with rehearsed grace. "Just us girls." Joanna kept her own smile soft, nearly sleepy. "I've missed this," she replied. Her voice was even, gentle, betraying nothing. Beneath her cardigan, secured to the inner lining of her handbag, a tiny digital recorder blinked quietly, its red light obscured by leather. She'd triple-checked the battery. The microphone was angled upward, precisely. She could hear every clink, every breath. Blake walked in from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel, his voice too casual. "Joanna, you're a sight for sore eyes. Harper said you might pop by." "Well, you know me," she said, stirring her tea. "I've never been one for surprises, or being left out of rooms I helped pay for." A flicker passed through Blake's expression. Just a twitch. But he recovered quickly, laughing. Right. No secrets here. It's all been such a process." Joanna leaned back slightly, her fingers resting near the saucer's rim. "So tell me," she said, eyes on Blake. "What exactly have you both been cleaning up with Dad's paperwork?" Harper froze mid-pour of honey into her cup. Blake blinked. "Well," he said, sitting down across from her, "you know how complicated trusts can be. Especially when someone's, well, declining. Robert wasn't really managing much by the end." Joanna raised an eyebrow. "But that's why we had co-trustees, wasn't it? Checks and balances. At least that was the plan when I helped draft it." Blake sipped his tea. "Sure, but after his stroke, I mean, you were overwhelmed." "Everyone was. We just wanted to keep things from spiraling." Joanna's spoon tapped gently against the porcelain, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You mean you wanted control, without oversight?" "That's not fair," Harper interjected, voice tight. "We only wanted to carry out his wishes." "I'm sure," Joanna said softly. "Which is why I'm curious what those wishes were, the ones that didn't require me present." She paused. "Or copied on filings." Blake tried to smile, but the edges of it sagged. "It was just legal housekeeping, Joanna. Tidying things, making sure assets were aligned." "Aligned where exactly?" No one answered. The recorder picked up the silence, the shifting of Blake's weight, Harper's nail clicking lightly against her cup. "You know," Blake said finally, "you don't need to worry. It's all handled, smoothly." Joanna tilted her head slightly. "And the home equity line opened 3 months after his second stroke? That was part of the tidy-up?" Harper's face flushed. "That was temporary. We needed it for renovations. But it came from a shared property, one I co-owned with Robert. That wasn't your call." Blake straightened, the charm slipping. "You weren't exactly available, Joanna. You were grieving." Joanna held his gaze for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Grieving doesn't mean gone. I didn't vanish. You just stopped seeing me." She stood slowly, adjusting the strap on her handbag. "Leaving already?" Harper asked, standing too. "I've had my fill," Joanna said. "Thank you for the tea." She moved toward the door, her spine steady, her steps light. The air outside hit her like clarity, brisk, scented faintly with lavender and distant rain. By the time she reached her car, the recorder was still running. She clicked it off, placed it gently in a padded case, and slid it into the glove compartment. Then she pulled out her phone and opened her email. To JNELSON@WINTHROPLEGAL.com. Subject: recorded admission. She attached the audio file, fingers steady. In the message body she typed, "Just left Harper's. They said it was legal housekeeping. I call it actionable. Let's prepare a quiet injunction." She hit send. And then she started the car. She sends the recording to her attorney with the message, "We'll need a quiet injunction. They left me out of the meeting. I filed for sole authority." The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of lemon wax and cooled tension. Too clean to feel honest, too silent to feel still. Joanna stood by the brass railing, fingers wrapped around the soft leather handle of her document binder. The marble beneath her shoes echoed every shift of weight like a warning. Once you move forward, you do not turn back. Her lawyer, Jenna Nelson, stood beside her in a fitted navy blazer, posture military straight, voice hushed but firm. The judge is old school. You let me lead, but when asked, don't downplay your role. Don't apologize. I won't, Joanna said softly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the closed double doors ahead. A bailiff opened them, motioning with a flat palm. Probate hearing. Collins v. Whitmore. Joanna stepped inside first. The courtroom wasn't grand, just deliberate. Neutral walls, a single flag, pale light filtering through vertical blinds. A woman with a laptop typed quickly in the corner. Blake and Harper sat at the opposing table whispering, both wearing expressions that teetered between annoyance and confidence. Blake's tie was knotted a little too tightly, Harper's blouse too pristine, costumes chosen with intent. But Joanna didn't look at them. She looked at the judge. Honorable R. Sloan, mid-60s, steel-gray hair parted with precision, face unreadable but alert. He glanced briefly over wire-rimmed glasses as Jenna stood. "Your Honor," she began, "we are submitting an emergency motion for full executorship authority on behalf of my client, Joanna E. Collins, co-author of the decedent's original trust and current legal trustee of record." Blake's lawyer, a sharp-jawed man with a laminated folder and smirking tone, rose immediately. "We object. This is a sudden escalation by someone not currently listed as the acting estate representative." Joanna's chin lifted half an inch. Jenna didn't flinch. "And yet," she said, sliding a document forward, "here is the original trust, co-signed by Robert Collins and my client. Here is the unfiled amendment Harper and Blake tried to pass off as valid, unsigned, and here," she tapped another page, "are financial transfers conducted under the decedent's name after his cognitive decline, without Joanna's consent, and in direct violation of fiduciary standards." The courtroom fell still. Even the court stenographer hesitated slightly, blinking. Judge Sloan leaned forward. "You're alleging fraud." "We're providing proof," Jenna replied. "Forged withdrawal forms, altered account access, plus an audio file of Mr. Blake Whitmore admitting to manipulating estate documents while the co-trustee was deliberately excluded." That part landed like a hammer. Blake shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward Harper. She didn't meet them. Joanna stayed still, hands folded, face calm but lit from within. The kind of calm that isn't quiet. It's strategic. The judge read in silence for a full minute. Then he spoke, voice slow. "This override clause, it names Ms. Collins as final executor in case of manipulation by secondary parties?" Jenna nodded. "Written by Robert himself, in Joanna's original handwriting per his request." He looked at the document again, then back at Joanna. "Were you aware of any actions taken against your interest prior to discovering these transfers?" "I suspected," Joanna said evenly, "but they confirmed it for me when they asked me to take a walk while the attorney arrived through the back gate." Judge Sloan didn't smile, but his eyes flickered. "Noted." He turned toward Blake's table. "Do you deny these financial shifts were made post-stroke?" Blake opened his mouth, then closed it. Harper's voice came out instead, low, brittle. We thought it was what he wanted. Sloan didn't bother hiding his skepticism. After a moment, he leaned back. Motion is under review, but given the documentation, I'm granting temporary sole executorship to Ms. Collins. All estate decisions are to be routed through her until full proceedings conclude. Joanna didn't move, but she felt it. The axis shifting, the room recalibrating. Harper stared at the judge. You're handing her everything? Just like that? No, Sloan said calmly. I'm handing her control. What happens next depends on whether this family intends to cooperate or escalate. Gavel. Single strike. Court adjourned. As they filed out, Harper brushed past Joanna without a glance, but Blake lingered, barely a breath away. His voice was a whisper, sharp as a splinter. You're not who I thought you were. Joanna looked up at him. I'm who your wife pretended I wasn't. Then she walked down the steps of the courthouse, wind brushing her coat open like a curtain being pulled back on a stage. Jenna followed, silent for a beat before saying, "Temporary's just the start." Joanna didn't stop walking. "Then let's make it permanent." The judge grants temporary full executorship to Joanna pending full review. They changed the passwords. I changed the locks. The first sign came quietly. No alarms, no confrontation. Just a polite access denied message blinking across Joanna's tablet at 6:42 a.m., followed by the gentle ping of a password reset confirmation she never requested. She stared at the screen in her kitchen, lit by soft morning light and the hiss of her old kettle warming on the stove. The bank login had worked 2 days ago. Now the interface offered her nothing but a locked door. She didn't panic. She padded across the tile floor in her slippers, took a slow breath, and reached for the yellow legal pad she kept in the drawer beneath her coffee mugs. On the top line, she wrote one word in careful cursive: response. By 7:12 a.m., she was dressed in slate gray slacks, her collar crisp, her lipstick a deliberate shade of rosewood, not war paint, but armor. She sat at her oak desk, the one Robert once used for tax season, and dialed the private line for Glenmark Wealth Management. The banker who answered, Rebecca Sloan, was courteous but cautious. "Ms. Collins, I'm looking at the account now. It appears the username was modified and the recovery phone number was updated as of yesterday evening." "By whom?" "Listed as authorized by Harper Whitmore, claiming spousal consolidation." Joanna's fingers curled slightly on the desk. She had no legal authority to do so. There was a pause on the line. Then Rebecca asked carefully, "Are you the current executor of record?" Joanna reached into her folder, slid out the stamped court order, and let her eyes scan the ink one more time before answering. "As of yesterday, I have full temporary executorship. I need you to place an immediate freeze on all trust-related transfers, including real estate withdrawals, investment moves, and grant dispersals." Rebecca hesitated. "We'll need documentation to proceed." "You'll have it in 10 minutes, Joanna said. "And Rebecca?" "Yes, Ms. Collins?" "This isn't a freeze for investigation. This is a freeze for protection. If even one penny moves without my approval, I'll escalate to fiduciary breach and subpoena every email thread." Another silence, then the faint clack of Rebecca's keyboard. "I'll flag the account now, pending legal review." Joanna hung up and exhaled slowly, her breath clouding slightly in the morning air. The house had cooled overnight, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the shift. Something structural. A quiet crack in the foundation of assumptions Harper and Blake had built around her. By 9 a.m., the documents had been scanned, stamped, and delivered. Joanna stood at the bank's reception counter herself to hand them over, dressed like a woman no longer asking for access, but reclaiming what was already hers. At noon, a sharp ding echoed across Blake's phone screen as he sat at his desk at the architectural firm, midway through drafting a pitch email. Alert. Trustee access revoked note. Outgoing transfers frozen by legal authority of Joanna E. Collins. He blinked, swore under his breath, and grabbed his phone. In the kitchen of their home, Harper was slicing oranges into a ceramic bowl when she heard the front door open faster than usual. "She locked it down," Blake muttered, holding the phone up. "Everything." Harper's hand hovered over the knife. How? She's got the court behind her. Harper stared at the backsplash. I thought you said she wouldn't go that far. She didn't go far. Blake's voice dropped. She went exactly where we hoped she wouldn't. Up the road, in a calm home with fresh flowers in the window and the original trust documents sitting in a blue binder beside a half-drunk cup of chamomile, Joanna opened her email. The bank had sent confirmation. She clicked once, then once more, to forward it. To Jenna Nelson. Subject: Confirmation received. Let's keep going. Blake receives an alert. Account frozen by legal authority of Joanna E. Collins. They bet on me forgetting. I remembered everything, especially the backup will. The lakehouse hadn't changed. Not in the way most places do, not in ways visible to the eye. The dock was still split near the end where Robert had always refused to replace the wood. The old bronze lantern still hung crooked above the porch, rust etching its own signature. And as Joanna stepped across the creaking planks of the front deck, the smell of pine sap and aged lake water stirred a grief that hadn't gone stale, only deeper, more measured. She unlocked the door with the original key, still smooth from years of use, and pushed it open. The air inside was cool, unmoved. That particular kind of hush only homes with history know how to hold. The kind built by two people in equal partnership, not papered over by whispered rewrites and greedy hands. Joanna didn't pause. Her heels clicked across the wide planked wood floors, echoing through the cabin like a metronome set to purpose. She passed the stone fireplace, the rocking chair still in its place beside it, and moved into the back study. Robert's study, not Harper's memory of him, not Blake's version of his legacy. Just Robert. She flipped on the brass lamp. The room flooded in amber light, soft but alert. In the corner, beneath a bookshelf that held everything from Thoreau to estate tax journals, was the old wall panel. Joanna bent, fingers brushing against the smooth groove in the cedar that no one else ever noticed. She pressed inward until the panel gave a slight click. A square of wood shifted loose. Behind it, the small gunmetal safe they'd installed in 1998. It didn't look like much. It was never supposed to. Joanna turned the dial with slow precision, muscle memory guiding her. 19-24-11. Her wedding date reversed. A private joke between them. When the lock released, it did so with a whisper, not a bang. Inside sat a red leather folder, flat and neat against the back wall of the safe. Nothing else, no jewelry, no cash, just what mattered. She took it out carefully, sat down at Robert's desk, and opened the folder. The first page was date, 14 months before Robert's death. The handwriting, his, was unmistakable, firm, looping, deliberate. Not a draft, not a whisper of intention. A notarized will, signed, witnessed, unambiguous. And the line she'd suspected but now read with undeniable clarity. I name my wife, Joanna E. Collins, as sole residual heir and executor of all assets not otherwise designated. No mention of Harper, no shared authority, no partial distribution in the event of incapacity. Just Joanna. She let her fingers rest on the edge of the paper. The air felt heavier now, or maybe it was just her lungs catching up with her spine. She flipped to the back, confirming the seal, raised, gold, embossed, and the signature of the notary public they'd used for decades, Sharon L. Martin. Joanna had almost forgotten this will existed. Almost. They'd written it on a quiet Sunday afternoon at this very desk. Harper had been traveling for a wellness retreat, and Robert had been reflective, speaking more candidly than he had in years. He'd said things like, I know where the loyalty has always come from, and I trust your instincts more than anyone else's. At the time, Joanna had smiled but didn't press. Now she understood. He knew what was coming, not his death. He was always too pragmatic for vague foresight. But the reshuffling that grief would invite, the vultures it would wake. She took a breath, stood, and slipped the folder into her tote bag. The leather was warm from her lap. It felt like walking out with a deed, not to property, but to narrative. An hour later, Joanna sat across from Jenna Nelson at the corner office of Crest and Henley Legal. The view stretched out over a narrow bend in the Potomac. Papers fluttered slightly from the desk fan. Jenna didn't speak for a long moment after reading. She only nodded, slowly, twice. "File a motion to void the current will," Joanna said, voice calm, almost clinical. "Undue influence, asset concealment, failure to disclose a later superseding document." "You want this public?" Jenna asked. Joanna met her gaze. "I want it permanent." Jenna nodded again, her fingers already flying over the keyboard. "She files a petition to replace the current will as fraudulent under undue influence. They used wine and laughter to distract. I used silence to strike." The wine was already poured when Joanna stepped into Harper's dining room, white linen tablecloth, flickering taper candles, soft jazz humming through the Bluetooth speaker like it was trying not to offend. The plates were arranged with surgical precision, napkins rolled and pinned with faux ivory rings. The aroma of roasted chicken, lemon zest, and something vaguely herbal filled the air, but it couldn't cover the underlying tension. It hung there, unscented, electric. Harper turned with a too bright smile. "Mom, you made it. You look lovely." Her tone had the brittle gloss of politeness strained through clenched teeth. "I dress for the occasion," Joanna replied smoothly, setting down a modest bottle of Merlot, her own contribution, though it would go unopened. Blake emerged from the kitchen carrying a serving tray of grilled asparagus, his sleeves rolled back, the kind of apron that said "Weekend Chef" without a trace of irony. "Let's all just enjoy tonight," he said, voice light. "No business?" "Just us." Joanna nodded, easing into the seat they'd clearly reserved for her, off to the side, but not too close to the head of the table. It was deliberate. They wanted her present, but sidelined, visible, but unheard. She took it in stride, folding her napkin neatly and resting her hands atop it like a woman attending her own arbitration hearing. Dinner began with too much small talk. Harper commented on Joanna's scarf. Blake joked about the neighbor's barking dog. The twins, seated at the far end, scrolled on their phones with absent smiles. Every word felt like filler, bubble wrap cushioning the real issue none of them wanted to touch. Halfway through the meal, Harper raised her glass. "To family," she said, "for showing up, for letting go, for moving forward." Joanna lifted her water glass in kind but said nothing. Her silence was not agreement. It was permission. The table settled into the soft clatter of silverware. That's when Joanna spoke. "I noticed the foundation ledger was missing from the account documents." The sentence sliced through the room like piano wire. Blake froze mid-cut through his chicken. Harper blinked. "Sorry, what?" Joanna dabbed her lips with her napkin. "Dad's charitable foundation. The quarterly fund summary's been removed from the shared folder. I was wondering why." Blake's fork hit the plate with a soft clink. I didn't think that was still active. Wasn't it merged into another entity?" "No," Joanna said quietly. "Not unless someone did so without filing a Schedule C with the state. Which would be odd, considering I still receive mail for it." Harper forced a laugh. "Mom, can we not? This isn't the night for—" But Joanna was already reaching into her handbag. She withdrew a thin, folded packet, neatly stapled, tabbed. She laid it on the table with a deliberate precision. "This says the last outgoing transfer from the foundation was $25,000, labeled Angel Contribution." Blake's jaw twitched. "It was a bridge loan, for a startup, temporary." Harper's voice sharpened. "That's Blake's friend. It's not what it sounds like." Joanna tilted her head. "Then enlighten me, because this ledger," she tapped the page gently, "shows it went directly into your friend Logan's Series A fund, a fund the IRS hasn't categorized as a charitable partner." The silence stretched long and tight. Blake looked at Harper. Harper looked away. Joanna leaned back, her voice calm. "The thing about laughter and wine is that they lose power once the ledgers start talking." She left the documents on the table, untouched chicken on her plate, water glass nearly full. The jazz track looped back to the beginning. Joanna drops a printed ledger on the table. "This says it went to your friend's tech startup. They wanted to preserve family image. I gave the reporter documents. The first question came just after the tea cooled and the recorder clicked on. Why now? The reporter asked. Joanna smiled, polite but unreadable. She folded her hands on her lap, her pearl bracelet resting gently against the armrest of the sunroom chair. Outside, rain misted softly against the windows, dappling the panes like the sky itself was eavesdropping. Because sometimes, Joanna said, silence is mistaken for surrender. And I thought it was time to clear that up. The journalist Claire Monroe, mid-40s, Pulitzer finalist, and known for slicing through public personas like paper, nodded without looking up from her notepad. She'd come with questions, but more importantly, she'd come with curiosity. Not the exploitative kind, but the kind that smells smoke and searches for the fire. The request for the interview had come from Claire's editor, who was pulling together a spotlight series titled Women and Wealth, Legacies at Risk. Claire had expected another vanilla sit-down with a retired banker or philanthropic heiress. What she hadn't expected was the private message she received from a contact listed only as JEC. The subject line had been blunt: trusts, transfers, and what happens when your own daughter forgets who signed the checks. Joanna had insisted on meeting off-record, no names, no photos, just context, just truth. But now, seated in her sunlit reading room with stacks of binders beside her and a box of digitized receipts humming on a flash drive, the off-record agreement was melting fast. Claire flipped to a new page in her notes. You said your husband was meticulous about transparency. Financials were joint, decisions shared. When did that change? Joanna took a breath. The scent of cardamom and baked scones drifted in from the kitchen where Linda was cleaning up their earlier tea. When his memory did, she answered. After the second stroke, Harper started pushing me out of conversations. Blake said it was too much for me, that I should focus on grief, not spreadsheets. Claire raised an eyebrow. And did you? I buried my husband with less dignity than I gave them with the accounts, Joanna said. Her voice didn't crack, but her thumb tapped once, softly, against her teacup. She opened a binder and slid it toward Claire. Inside were color-coded tabs, all dated, some highlighted in yellow. Foundation withdrawal. $25,000 to Logan Hayes, unregistered recipient. Property transfer form. Unsigned by Joanna, stamped 2 months before Robert's death. A handwritten note from Robert to protect Joanna if things ever get unclear. Claire's fingers slowed as she read. You know this could burn bridges. Joanna nodded. I built the damn bridge. They're just standing on it. They sat in silence for a moment, broken only by the faint buzz of Linda's phone vibrating on the counter. Joanna pushed another folder across the table. Claire blinked at the label. Affidavit of Executor Override. You're still active in court? Joanna smirked faintly. Harper and Blake think I'm bluffing, that all I want is a room at Thanksgiving, but I want something more dangerous than that. What's that? Accountability. Claire's eyes met hers, serious now. If I write this, even anonymously, someone will recognize the story. I know, Joanna said, and so will they, which is why I want it written. Claire leaned back in her chair. The recorder light blinked red. And the name of the foundation again? Joanna tilted her head, voice crisp. Collins Endowment Fund, registered nonprofit, but you might find the last tax return. Interesting. The article ran quietly at first. Sunday edition, page 3. No photo. Just a title in clean serif font. Widow fights back after daughter rewrites estate behind her back. It began with a quote. They said grief clouded my judgment, but it sharpened my memory. The phone in Harper's kitchen buzzed 5 times that morning. Blake's inbox flooded with questions, and somewhere, across town, Joanna folded her paper neatly, highlighting only the line that mattered. The piece runs Sunday. Widow fights back after daughter rewrites estate behind her back. They smiled in public. I seized everything in private. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded neatly inside an envelope the same shade as courthouse walls. Joanna didn't send it herself. That would have given them time to preen and prepare. She let her attorney serve it. Certified mail, signature required. A quiet, official knock at 8:07 a.m. that Harper mistook for a package delivery. She opened the door still in her silk robe, mug in hand, the scent of cinnamon creamer swirling with early spring air. "Miss Collins?" the courier asked, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Walker?" she corrected. The man didn't blink. "Signature, please." Inside the envelope, a formal notice of reclamation. Effective immediately, per breach of verbal and fiduciary agreement, the residence at 913 Delmar Avenue would revert to Joanna Elaine Collins, full legal owner. The judge's interim ruling had granted Joanna a temporary title transfer pending final probate review. That meant Harper and Blake had exactly 30 days to vacate the house they'd smugly rebranded as their own. By 9:15 a.m., Joanna received the first text from Harper. "What the hell is this?" Joanna didn't reply. At 10:02, a second one landed. "This is harassment. You're not thinking clearly. Let's talk about this." Still, Joanna said nothing. She was in her sunroom with a glass of iced mint water, reviewing contractor estimates for repainting the guest room. The one Harper had once painted over in gray and called utility overflow. Joanna was thinking of a soft lilac now, something that warmed with the light. Meanwhile, Harper paced her kitchen like the marble beneath her heels might crack open. Blake sat at the island, phone in hand, staring down the legal language like it might rearrange itself if he blinked hard enough. "This can't be happening," Harper muttered, rereading the letter for the fourth time. "She doesn't get to just take it back." "She can," Blake said flatly. "She did." Harper's voice went shrill. "We made improvements. That backsplash, the porch swing, that was our money." Blake stood. "That was her trust fund. She froze the accounts, remember?" In response, Harper flung open the fridge, pulled out a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, and poured herself a glass at barely past 11. The sharp clink of the bottle on granite echoed like punctuation. Meanwhile, back at her duplex 2 miles away, Joanna opened a second manila folder, this one marked Delmar Transfer, Historical Records. Inside were notarized photos of her wiring $240,000 into escrow 5 years ago, checks written for the original landscaping, and the signed draft agreement Harper had once called silly overkill. Joanna had always known sentimentality wasn't enforceable in court, but signatures were. That afternoon, she drove to Delmar Avenue. Not to argue, not to threaten, just to walk through what was still legally her home. She arrived unannounced, humming under her breath, wearing soft heels and a scarf the color of robin's eggs. Blake answered the door with a grim jaw. "Didn't think you'd come in person," he said. "I like to see my property before renovations," Joanna said smoothly, brushing past him. Harper appeared in the hallway, face flushed. "You don't get to redecorate this like a hotel." Joanna paused mid-step. "Number I get to reclaim it like an inheritance." She made no demands, no speeches. She simply walked the perimeter, tapping on walls, noting the floors, inspecting the guest bath where Harper had once whispered about Joanna being a little too attached. The same guest bath Joanna had paid to tile, twice. In the kitchen, Joanna reached for the notepad on the fridge and scribbled something slowly, her cursive as deliberate as a judge's ruling. Then, without another word, she tore the sheet free and taped it dead center on the stainless steel door. The sound of the tape sticking, soft, final, was the only thing Harper could hear over the racing in her ears. Joanna stepped outside, adjusted her scarf, and closed the front door behind her. A breeze kicked up, lifting a single corner of the note just long enough for Harper to see what it said. "You called it fair. I called it mine." Joanna leaves a letter taped to the fridge. "You called it fair. I called it mine. She used to watch me from the hallway. Now she's my co-counsel." The first time Julia sat across from a judge, she had to remind herself she wasn't 9 years old anymore, watching Aunt Joanna seal envelopes at the kitchen table with court stamps and a neat precision that once felt like magic. Now, that same table had been turned into a strategy hub, yellow legal pads stacked beside Joanna's ceramic. Tea set, case files layered with red tabs, and Julia herself perched with posture too sharp for her age, eyes scanning breach statutes like they were scripture. Blake used Dad's power of attorney after the stroke, Joanna said, pushing a folder forward. But it was conditional, only for medical coordination, not financial execution. Julia opened the folder and clicked her pen. So, the moment he used it to reroute assets into the new shell account, he broke the trust, Joanna finished, voice cold and clean, and likely broke the law. There was no bitterness in Joanna's tone, just clarity. She'd long passed the stage of emotional shock. Now she was an accountant of betrayal, counting the ledgers of every lie. Julia, her dark hair tied in a firm, low bun, leaned forward, eyes steady behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'll draft the fiduciary breach claim, we'll list every transfer, name Harper as a silent co-beneficiary, and tie it to motive using your property seizure as evidence of retaliation. Joanna offered a small nod, one that carried the weight of 20 years of whispered dismissal. Good. Make it clean. Make it tight. When Julia filed the claim the following Thursday, Harper and Blake responded like they'd just heard a rumor from a PTA meeting, with smug disbelief. Harper smirked when she read the notice. "She's using our niece?" Harper said, waving the document like a shopping list. "This is what desperation looks like." Blake chuckled. "Must have run out of real lawyers." Their confidence didn't waver until the court called for a pre-evidentiary hearing and requested that both parties appear with all supporting documentation in hand. Joanna arrived first. Julia walked beside her, crisp in a navy suit with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Her heels echoed evenly down the marble hallway, matching her aunt's slower, more deliberate steps. Blake and Harper arrived 5 minutes late. Harper wore designer neutrals. Blake carried nothing but a phone and a water bottle. Neither had bothered to bring their attorney yet. Joanna looked at Julia. "They didn't think we'd make it real." "They're about to learn," Julia replied. Inside the courtroom, the judge, gray-bearded and stern, adjusted his reading glasses and addressed the table. "We're here to establish whether sufficient evidence exists to move forward with fiduciary breach proceedings. Ms. Collins, do you have representation?" Joanna gestured toward Julia. "This is Julia Beck, licensed and bar-certified as of May. She'll be representing me under counsel." Julia stood, chin steady. "Your Honor, we've prepared preliminary documentation including banking records, power of attorney scope, and a digital audit trail of transfers made without consent or oversight." The judge nodded. "Submit your exhibits for the record." Julia stepped forward, placing a navy folder on the clerk's desk. The tab on the first divider read in sharp block lettering, "Unauthorized transfers." "Exhibit." A Blake stiffened. Harper leaned over to whisper, eyes darting between the judge and the folder like a cat watching a swinging door. The judge flipped open the folder, eyes scanning the first few pages. He lifted one. A transfer log. Account ending in 0321, moved to an LLC registered in Blake's name, dated 5 weeks after Robert's second stroke. Next page. An internal bank memo. Flagged activity. No supporting medical authorization. The judge's brow furrowed. He looked at Blake. "Do you have legal counsel present?" Blake coughed. "Not today. We didn't think—" "You should have," the judge said. "I'll allow a continuance for formal representation, but this," he held up the transfer log, "isn't going away." Julia didn't smile, but her spine relaxed half an inch. Joanna leaned in close. "Well done." Julia didn't look away from the judge's bench. "We're just getting started." Julia opens a file in court labeled, "Unauthorized Transfers." Exhibit A. "They didn't expect me to show up. I brought receipts." The courtroom wasn't grand, just 4 beige walls, humming fluorescents, and a sagging American flag in one corner, but Joanna walked into it like it was the stage she'd been denied her whole life. Her heels struck tile with quiet certainty. Not loud, just steady. Her posture didn't beg to be seen. It demanded it. At the petitioner's table, Harper was already seated, dressed in a pale blue suit that looked more like armor than fabric. Beside her, their new attorney, a younger man with slicked-back hair and a smugness that clung to him like cologne, was flipping through papers with the distracted confidence of someone who thought the verdict was already in. Joanna took her seat with Julia at her side. A thin manila file folder rested atop the table in front of them, modest in appearance, devastating in content. Judge Merriman adjusted his bifocals and glanced at the case file. Collins versus Whitaker. Today's hearing will review the petitioner's claims of fiduciary breach and contest of trust and authority. The defense rose first. Harper's attorney gave a practiced smile and cleared his throat. Your Honor, opposing counsel's claims rest on emotionally biased interpretation. My client, Mrs. Whitaker, has acted within the spirit and intention of her late father's wishes. This proceeding, he gestured broadly, is largely the result of emotional instability and grief-driven vendettas. Joanna didn't flinch. Julia stood, smooth as a violin string tightening. Your Honor, we'd like to enter the following into evidence. The original notarized trust co-signed by Joanna and Robert Collins, a secondary handwritten will verified by notary public, and an audio file of a conversation in which Mr. Blake Whitaker admits to cleaning up the financials after Mr. Collins's stroke, without legal authority. There was a quiet shift in the room. Harper's attorney blinked, recalibrating. The judge looked over his glasses. You have the original documents? Joanna met his eyes directly. Yes, Your Honor. In my possession since the date of notarization, stored in a fireproof safe at our secondary residence, retrieved with key code and verified by our estate attorney. Julia placed the thick manila folder on the clerk's desk and flipped it open. The room held its breath. On top, a photocopy of the trust, Joanna's signature looped in navy ink beside Robert's, and the executor override clause highlighted in soft yellow. Beneath that, the second will, signed, dated, notarized. Robert's unmistakable scrawl, shakier than usual but unmistakably his. And finally, the USB drive, labeled in Julia's even handwriting, Exhibit C, audio recording, April 4th, 11:12 a.m. The judge held up the drive like it was more loaded than a gavel. This has been verified? Chain of custody documented, Julia confirmed. Recording captured in person, in the presence of both parties. Judge Merriman glanced toward Harper's table. Any objections? Harper leaned in to her attorney. Her lips moved rapidly, her hands twitching with suppressed panic. Her lawyer frowned, then looked up. Your Honor, we reserve the right to challenge the recording's admissibility at a later hearing, but will proceed with today's review. The judge nodded once, then turned back to Joanna. His voice gentled, but held authority. Ms. Collins. She folded her hands in her lap. Would you be willing to take the stand? Harper's face paled. The sound of her bracelet shifting against her wrist echoed like a loose chain in a quiet cell. Joanna stood and smiled. The judge says, Ms. Collins, please take the witness stand. They walked me out once. I walked them out with a bailiff. The silence inside the courtroom wasn't empty. It throbbed, tense and waiting, like the held breath before a gavel falls. Joanna sat straighter than she had in weeks, her palms resting flat on the table as if grounding herself to this moment. Across from her, Harper tapped a single manicured nail against the wooden surface. Her jaw clenched so tightly Joanna could see the vein in her temple start to pulse. Judge Merriman shuffled the pages in front of him. Not quickly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Each sheet a loaded verdict waiting to be unholstered. In matters of probate and contested trust, the judge began, his voice slow and even, the court weighs intent, execution, and integrity of the estate's administration. Joanna didn't blink. The courtroom's air smelled of varnished wood, faint, stale coffee, and something else, an undercurrent of sweat, maybe. Pressure always left a trace. I've reviewed original trust documents, supplemental recordings, and verified statements of financial activity submitted by both counsel. He set his glasses on the desk and looked directly at Joanna. Ms. Collins, your evidence was thorough. Harper shifted. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but Judge Merriman raised one hand. No interruptions. He turned to the clerk. Please read the ruling into record. Joanna held her breath, not out of fear, but ritual. The kind of stillness that only comes when a war you've been fighting silently for months finally starts to name its casualties. The court finds in favor of Joanna E. Collins, the clerk read. Ms. Collins is hereby granted full and uncontested executorship of the Robert M. Collins estate. Effective immediately, Joanna exhaled quietly, but her face remained unreadable. Additionally, the clerk continued, the court rules that Harper L. Whitaker and Blake D. Whitaker acted outside fiduciary bounds and are to forfeit any administrative control, financial access, or benefit derived from the estate, pending restitution of all diverted funds. The words hung like glass suspended mid-shatter. Harper's breath hitched. Blake muttered something sharp under his breath that made their lawyer's face flush a sudden, splotchy red. In terms of financial return, the judge interjected, glancing again at the paperwork, Ms. Collins will receive all asset originally designated to her, including but not limited to liquid investments, property shares, and residual retirement accounts. There it was, restoration, not just in principle, but in ink. The gavel struck once, not loud, but final. Court adjourned. Joanna stood slowly. She didn't look toward Harper or Blake. She didn't need to. The weight of the ruling was already settling on their shoulders like wet wool, uncomfortable, undeniable, and impossible to shrug off. Ms. Collins, the bailiff approached with quiet respect, handing her a red-stamped manila envelope. This just arrived from county records. She opened it. Inside, a crisp, white deed transfer form. At the top, in bold, clean font, title transfer, primary residence, 14 Hollow Creek Lane, new sole title holder, Joanna Elaine Collins. Below it, the registrar's stamp, still damp. Harper's voice, sharp and disbelieving, broke the room's hush. You can't be serious. That house, our house, was never meant to be hers. The bailiff stepped forward, calm but firm. Ma'am, I'll need you and your husband to vacate the property within 30 days, per court directive and breach of agreement clause. You've been notified. Joanna finally turned, not cruel, not smug, just complete. You walked me out once, she said quietly. Now the door swings the other way. Harper's face crumpled, but no tears came. Just disbelief. Blake stood rigid, arms folded, nostrils flaring. But he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Joanna walked out of the courtroom with the deed in her hand and sunlight waiting on the other side of the doors. Julia caught up to her just outside, still holding her briefcase tight to her chest like it contained something fragile and holy. You did it, Julia whispered. Joanna didn't smile. I restored it, she said. Now I decide what to do with it. Joanna's attorney hands her the new house deed, stamped and certified. They painted over my memories. I painted them out of the picture. The first thing Joanna did was take down the canvas in the front hallway, the one Harper had hung to match the color palette. It was a bland coastal landscape, all gray skies and tasteful fog. Joanna didn't bother storing it. She set it by the curb, face down. She stood there a moment, listening to the quiet echo of her footsteps bounce off the hardwood floors that had once muffled other people's secrets. Now they sounded different, clearer, unashamed. Light streamed through the foyer window, catching the gold edge of the deed still tacked to her corkboard. There was something symbolic about seeing it gleam like that, like the house itself had been waiting for her to come back with a name that mattered. In the living room, she peeled off the pale gray throw pillows Harper had once insisted on, replacing them with richer textures, wool, velvet, a pop of deep garnet. She opened the cedar chest she'd stored in a rental unit for nearly a year and pulled out her old grandmother's quilt. The scent of lavender sachets clung to the fabric like memory itself. It wasn't revenge she was after now. It was resurrection. Harper's home office, once an icy palette of navy and chrome, was next. Joanna opened the door, letting her eyes adjust to the sharp, sterile minimalism. Whiteboard, ergonomic chair, framed quote, "Discipline is freedom." She let out a soft laugh. Let's free some real people then. 2 days later, the desk was gone. In its place, a rounded oak table, 3 vintage chairs, a bookshelf filled with legal guides and estate planning workbooks. Julia had donated half of them. The rest came from a nearby nonprofit eager to partner on the idea that had bloomed quietly in Joanna's mind weeks earlier, when she'd first felt the slam of a door meant to exclude her. Now, that same door would open wide. She placed a placard on the table's edge. The Hollow Creek Project, Legal Literacy for Women. 55-plus Joanna didn't rush the transformation. She moved slowly, room by room, memory by memory. In the guest room, she hung the watercolor portrait her late husband had commissioned for their 35th anniversary, the one Harper had stashed in a closet after calling it dated. It belonged in the open now. So did she. The kitchen, once perfumed with rosemary and control, now smelled of ginger tea and polished copper. She replaced the wine fridge with a lockable cabinet and filled it with herbal blends, spare slippers, and folders, each labeled with a name of a woman who'd emailed her since the article ran. The stories were chillingly similar. He said it was just paperwork. Turned out it was my retirement. They called it a gift. It was a lifetime of savings. I didn't even know what a constructive trust was until I needed one. She didn't need to explain to anyone why she was doing this. The women already knew. On the 7th day, she stood at the sliding glass doors and stared out at the back porch. It had been repainted sometime during the past year, blanched to match Harpy. Pinterest aesthetic. Joanna walked out barefoot, the sun warm beneath her toes, and touched the wooden railing gently. "This is where they sent me on that walk," she murmured, then turned and faced the house. "Now it's where I walk back in." She checked her phone. 5 replies, all yeses. Champagne in the fridge, a tray of lemon bars on the counter, folded napkins in linen and plum. By 6 p.m., the women had arrived, 5 of them, all in their 60s or 70s, all carrying a story and something to uncork. In the soft light of early evening, with cicadas humming and garden lights flickering on above them, Joanna lifted her glass. "To what was never a gift," she said, "only an investment waiting to mature." Laughter, not polite but real, rippled across the porch, the kind that shakes loose the dust of shame. And then came a knock, not from the front, from the side gate. Joanna set down her glass and stepped toward the sound, the porch lights casting her shadow across the boards she now stood fully upon. They made decisions without me. I made one they can never undo. It was nearly dusk when Joanna unlocked the drawer beneath her writing desk, the one she hadn't touched since Robert's funeral. The metal creaked faintly as it slid open, the old wood swollen slightly with time. Inside was her estate binder, dark green leather with worn corners and her initials embossed on the spine. She lifted it slowly, brushing her fingertips along the edges like one might skim the surface of a still lake before diving in. The last time she'd opened it, Harper was still calling every day, still signing emails, "Love you, Mom," still pretending they were on the same side of grief. Now, the air in the room felt different. Not colder, cleaner. Joanna unzipped the binder, flipped past the original trust and the updated deed, and landed on the tab labeled Final Directives. The familiar notary's seal sat at the top of the page, her own signature below it, and a blank space left open, intentionally. She had written those instructions nearly a decade ago, under the naive belief that love meant protection. Tonight, she rewrote them with clarity instead of hope. She picked up her fountain pen and began. Beneficiaries: Julia Collins, niece, full inheritance of real property, personal assets, and securities. Hollow Creek Women's Fund, 35% of retirement account plus endowment grant. Carter Lowell Scholarship, in memory of Robert Collins, 20% for women pursuing law, finance, or nonprofit work. She paused at Harper's name. The line was still there, typed, untouched, original. She drew a clean, dark line through it. The silence in the room felt approving. Outside, the streetlights blinked on in rhythmic sequence. Joanna closed the binder, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it with a satisfying click. The pen, still warm from her hand, she set carefully beside a stack of new blank envelopes marked, in the event of, she wouldn't need all of them. But it felt good to be ready. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of chamomile and pine oil. The guests from earlier had gone, leaving behind 3 empty glasses, a dusting of lemon zest on the serving plate, and a thank you card tucked under her coaster that read, "Thank you for making space for stories that usually get buried." Joanna smiled as she folded it, pressing the crease with her thumb. She pulled on her light overcoat, wrapped a scarf around her shoulders, and stepped outside into the early evening. The porch light glowed behind her, casting soft gold along the brick path. She locked the front door, not just out of habit, but possession. Then she walked. The street felt both familiar and new. The same sidewalk she had once paced in confusion now greeted her with quiet affirmation. Trees rustled softly overhead. The air held that late autumn crispness that pinched the nose and carried the faintest scent of chimney smoke. She passed the corner lot where the Hendersons used to host 4th of July parties, then the split-level home with the chipped green shutters. Each step brought her closer to the spot where it had all begun. That first walk, the one they sent her on to get some air, while they met in whispered circles, closing in on a decision she was never meant to hear. Back then she had walked slowly, unsure whether she was paranoid or perceptive. That afternoon, she'd looked up at the roofline of Harper's home and wondered how many years she'd spent being careful, polite, deferential. Tonight she wasn't walking away from a decision. She was walking with one in her hand. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Matt. "Saw the deed transfer notice. Hope we can talk sometime. I didn't know it would come to this." She didn't reply. Let silence do the talking. At the end of the block she paused, her hand resting gently on the gate of the same house she once funded, walked through, and was quietly written out of. The porch light was off now. The yard unkempt. A for sale sign leaned slightly sideways in the lawn, as if the wind no longer respected it. Joanna turned. She walked home, not to someone else's house, not to a room labeled guest, but to her own. Her porch light waiting. Her name on the deed. Her legacy rescripted. As she slipped the key back into the lock and opened the door, the warmth inside greeted her like an old friend. "They made decisions behind my back. I made one they'll never forget."